Star Wars usually centers on prophecy, heroic lineage, and destiny, but Andor opens with a different premise. Cassian is not chosen. He is not guided by a mentor, and he does not represent a foretold future. The opening sequence places him in a dim industrial corridor, asking questions about someone he believes is holding information. This introduction frames the galaxy as a place shaped by decisions, not fate, and the viewer sees immediately that outcomes emerge from actions rather than from predetermined roles. The show emphasizes labor and economics. Ferrix is not a mythic location. It is a working community, defined by routine, loud machinery, and physical labor. People maintain equipment, trade parts, and operate salvage yards. The streets have an audible rhythm, and that rhythm comes from actual work rather than dramatic orchestration. Instead of focusing on magical abilities, the story studies how an economy functions under pressure. Salvage work trade and informal networks define survival. Cassian scrapes together. Value B. Andor uses dialogue-heavy scenes instead of spectacle early on. Cassian negotiates with Bix about moving a valuable component, and their interaction centers on access risk and leverage. Cassian seeks financial advantage, while Bix needs plausible deniability. The tension is not framed as a test of moral worth. It is a question of whether Cassian can manage relationships without compromising himself. The scene establishes how trust and consequences drive progress in the narrative, not destiny or prophecy. The pre-Maw security officers who pursue Cassian are presented as employees following procedure, rather than archetypal villains. Their actions provide insight into how power spreads through tasks, reports, and administrative decisions. The officers focus on policy enforcement and reputation, rather than grand ideology. One supervisor attempts to avoid escalation, while another insists on pushing the case forward against advice. This difference reveals how organizations drift into harmful behavior through ambition. Cassian becomes a suspect because of a mistake from security management, not because of a prophecy or chosen status. The officer in charge chooses to pursue the case. Despite advice to ignore it, this creates a chain reaction that escalates the story. A decision leads to consequence, and consequence leads to pursuit. The narrative, logic is built from cause and effect rather than mythic escalation. The show argues that institutions amplify harm when individual decisions stack without oversight, and that this propels. The structure of the first 3 episodes focuses on systems, rather than spectacle scenes show how ships attract, how supply chains operate, and how organizations communicate, rather than jumping directly to a chase. The show demonstrates every step of a process. The viewer sees how information moves through a structure, and how delay or hesitation changes outcomes. This structure illustrates that narrative momentum is built through process mapping rather than heroic revelation. Andor highlights that rebellion begins with private intent rather than public display. Cassian wants to avoid attention, not lead a cause. His initial choices are transactional and driven by immediate needs. The story suggests that the beginning of resistance often starts unintentionally through personal necessity before it becomes purposeful organization, and this perspective treats rebellion as something built from patterns of behavior rather than dramatic declarations. The cinematography reinforces this grounded premise. Lighting angles and lens choices favor industrial environments and functional spaces over symbolic imagery. Warehouses, alleys, storage yards, and housing structures dominate the frame. Materials look used rather than staged, and the production design avoids glamour. This visual approach supports the analytic claim that daily life in this world is shaped by work obligation and scarcity, by avoiding spectacle. The visuals keep attention on the mechanics of survival. Even the audio design reflects practicality. Alarms, tools, and machinery replace orchestral spectacle. Instead of using leitmotifs to suggest heroic identity, the soundscape prioritizes environment and process. Footsteps echo through narrow corridors. Warning bells are struck manually, and conversations are punctuated by ambient mechanical noise. The audio informs the viewer about workflow communication patterns and operational movement, which strengthens the argument that narrative tension emerges from daily funct. By the end of the first major arc, Cassian is not transformed into a leader. His situation has simply shifted his choices. place him in contact with a network that is already in motion. Andor argues that movements form through layered decisions rather than through a single defining moment. This analytical stance challenges the idea that Star Wars needs destiny to produce meaningful stakes. It proposes that narrative power can come from observing structure, consequence, and accumulated decisions without relying on. The second unit of analysis begins by examining how Andor depicts power through data management rather than intimidation. The Imperial Security Bureau reviews reports tracks unusual activity and cross-references shipping irregularities. Dedra Miro searches through files and identifies patterns that other officers ignore. Her progress does not come from force or authority, it comes from systematic observation and interpretation. The narrative demonstrates that power depends on information, not presence. Dedra's advancement occurs because she identifies overlooked details within mundane reports. She pulls a thread from scattered incidents and organizes them into a structure. Her actions demonstrate how power expands when individuals understand systems more effectively than others rather than relying on status. She relies on process. This reveals that control originates from mastery of procedure, rather than mythic superiority. Systems reward accuracy and consistency, not destiny. The ISB briefings showcase decision-making through collective revision officers, present data and challenge each other's conclusions. No single figure defines direction. Instead, the group clarifies strategy through structured conversation. This scene shows how organizations refine action through documentation and feedback loops. The narrative shows that authority emerges from collaboration rather than symbolic leadership. The show's portrayal of financial strategy provides a second major angle. Mon Mothma hides transactions within legitimate accounts and masks subversive funding through procedural complexity. This approach demonstrates that resistance requires understanding the same systems that enable control rather than escaping them. Change requires navigating bureaucracy with precision rather than rejecting it entirely. Luthen introduces another analytical dimension. His planning does not rely on prediction or fate. He creates options through planning and information flow. When he coordinates the heist, he uses multiple independent cells that do not know each other. His method resembles compartmentalization within intelligence organizations. Each group sees only its immediate task, reducing exposure and managing risk. This is a logistical model, not a mythic one. To further analyze the logistics of resistance, the prison breakout shows how structure can be inverted rather than destroyed. Cassian studies timing positioning and the location of control panels. The uprising succeeds because procedure is disrupted at critical points rather than through symbolic confrontations. Kino provides instructions that are explicit and measurable rather than motivational. The scene demonstrates that clarity, not inspiration, drives coordinated action. Another unique angle is how community infrastructure influences collective decision-making. Ferrix uses a communal bell tower and scheduled work cycles. The entire community functions through predictable rhythm and shared responsibility when incidents occur. People react based on role position and habit rather than inspiration or fear. The story suggests that culture and routine shape action more reliably than ideology. The escalation toward rebellion in Ferrix illustrates message distribution rather than character focus. Marva's recorded message conveys information, not encouragement. Her words detail observable harm and explain how continued compliance strengthens oppression. The crowd does not act because of emotional allegiance, but because the message clarifies reality. The community chooses action based on assessment, not inspiration. A further angle appears in how the finale handles crowd dynamics rather than centering on a single protagonist. The scene tracks multiple groups moving along different paths, each responding to shifts in the environment. This distributed structure demonstrates that rebellion is scalable, and self-organizing changes in flow and direction occur without a central leader. Events are driven by situational awareness, not predetermined outcome. Andor also shows that withdrawal of cooperation destabilizes power more than confrontation. Individuals refuse to follow routine, and systems collapse because compliance is removed rather than attacked. This illustrates a structural principle. When an institution requires universal participation, withholding participation becomes disruptive. At scale, resistance is framed as a procedural void rather than a clash of heroes. This analysis leads to a final unifying conclusion. Andor argues that the strength of Star Wars does not require destiny or prophecy. It requires credible cause and effect systems that track decisions, consequences, structures, and outcomes. Narrative power emerges from showing how organizations function and how they fail. Rebellion grows when enough individuals identify gaps in the system and choose not to reinforce them. Change comes from knowledge, coordination, and decision. Through process economy, logistics, and information, Andor demonstrates that meaningful stakes do not depend on legacy characters. The story functions because every event is grounded in structure, not prophecy. Andor proposes that Star Wars becomes more compelling when it studies systems rather than symbols, because a galaxy shaped by decisions is one where anyone, not just a chosen figure, can change the outcome.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.